Hey everybody, and welcome back to Moto with Ellery. In this episode, we're going to be looking at creating material variation using texture layers. Now, we've had some other episodes where we've talked about textures and materials, and in this one, we're more going to be looking not at creating a specific material, in as much as we're going to be looking at some techniques and some principles behind adding material variation. So some things that you can do to help both fine-tune and speed up the process to allow you to get more detailed textures or more detailed materials using textures. All right, so just a little bit of vocabulary as we get started. So a material is, when I'm referring to a material, I'm referring to pretty much everything going on a specific surface. So if we take, for example, the skin on this character, it's going to be everything that hits that. It's going to be the material that is usually at the bottom of the stack, and then it's going to be all of the textures. So that's the other thing we'll refer to, textures, which are going to be the individual layers that help break up that material. Now, in some ways, this might be a relatively basic video, but this is the kind of thing that I get a lot of questions on, both on other videos I've had questions on, as well as something that I get a lot of questions and hiccups and difficulties with my own students as we're working on things of this nature. So if you want to see more about the lighting setup that we've got here going on, check out the previous episode where we actually go through the setup of this lighting rig, or this lighting scenario rather, using the direct lights inside of Moto. We're actually going to switch this out for an easier to render one so we can get faster previews, but more on that in a second. And what we're going to be looking at here is going to be kind of the difference between starting out where we are on the right here and moving to what we see on the left. So at the basic level, if you just kind of squint your eyes a little bit and look at these, they're going to look very, very similar. They both are using a basic subsurface shading material. This isn't a skin shader like the actual skin shader in Moto, though all of this stuff would apply to a skin shader as well. That just has a lot more levels to it that are built in, so we'd have to add in a lot more variation. So I find that just doing a regular kind of subsurface scattering faux skin shader actually is going to be better to demonstrate the point. So we're going to be starting with something like this, and then we're going to be looking at how to create the variation that we'll see with something like this on the left. We'll actually set it up a little bit differently because we're going to do it from scratch, and we're actually going to look at adding a few extra things here. And really what we want to be looking at is you want to start by basically getting everything, the general idea of your material, into just the basic shader. So if I select this shader here, you can see I've got kind of this light skin color on my diffuse color. I've got just basic amounts for specular and Fresnel. I've got a specular color that's a little bit kind of a paler, lighter version of the diffuse. Our roughness is set to 40%, which is just the default. Some settings for bump amplitude and whatnot if you want to use bump or displacement. And then moving into material trans, we have nothing on transparency, but subsurface amount, we've got 50% with a more reddish color. And then some just basic subsurface values that are going to allow us to have something that approximates a very, very simple skin shader. Now, if you're actually going to be doing this kind of thing with an actual skin shader, you'll have more things that you can plug in, which are basically just going to be looking at different levels of subsurface amount kind of below the surface of the skin. If you're just doing the simplified version, you basically have what's on the surface and what's underneath the surface, two layers, and then some reflection on top, and that's about it. So this is just kind of our basic material here, and this is going to be a good starting point, and this is going to be where I would recommend starting if you just want to follow along with the video. Obviously, you can do this with other materials of your own creation. That's totally fine as well. So what I've got here, and this is the same material that I had set up for the previous video where we looked at lighting. I've got a skin details folder here, which we're actually going to hide in a moment, and it just has several different layers that are affecting diffuse color, specular color, roughness, bump, a little more diffuse and specular color, a little more roughness, diffuse amount, and then also the subsurface amount, because we don't necessarily want our subsurface to be the same all across the surface. So there are two big actual things that we'll want to look at when we're creating more complicated textures. And the two things that I'm going to focus on here a lot, and these are going to be things that will help you both have more control over your creation of materials, but they're also going to allow you to work a lot faster. And those two things are isolation and bracketing. So isolation is going to be that we will set up and be able to look at each individual layer that we add on in its own, distinct place. So we're essentially going to start by looking at most things as they pertain just as a diffuse color, and then that's going to allow us to take that and more easily fine-tune our textures before we put them into the place that they go. So that's isolation. And the second one is bracketing. And what this comes back to with our basic material is, if you have everything set up on a basic material, just one layer, your material layer, and that's it. If you have everything set up so it looks okay, very simple, simplified, but okay. Maybe this is a little too glossy across his forehead, or too much subsurface on the nose, or whatever, but it's in the ballpark. Then we'll use our material as the basis, and our textures will then bracket in what we've already set up. So for example, if we happen to have 80% diffuse, and the 80% diffuse works pretty well, okay, then as we go in and we start bracketing, we'll create a texture, and maybe that texture will go from 70 to 90%. Whereas our basic texture was just at 80%. So you see we get this bracketing in, and that way we're keeping everything in the general range of our original texture, but at the same time we're adding more detail into it. Now there might be times that bracket won't be an even bracket. Perhaps you have, again, I'll just use diffuse color set at 80%, but that is really as light as you want the diffuse color to go. Then maybe we'll work from 50 to 80 or 60 to 80, and we'll widen those brackets as we see fit in order to add more detail to the textures. But that bracketing will help us keep the general spirit of the texture kind of in place. And then as a secondary benefit, if you have a base material that everything else is just nicely bracketed in and works on top of that, then you can very easily do kind of what I've done here, where you have all of your extra detail layers. You can put them into a separate group, and then you can hide them as needed if you're going to do test renders or things like that, where you don't need all this detail, because you can see here that the one on the right took 1 minute and 17 seconds to refine, whereas the one on the left, with all of the render settings the same, but just adding in the extra layers, took 2 minutes and 13 seconds. So we're in the ballpark of double the render time. So if you have all these things set up nicely and you're using your base material as a good starting point or jumping off point, then you can very easily kind of use that as your stand-in, if you're doing other kinds of renders where you're not looking at that specific material and you don't need a final render. All right, so before we actually get started building this, we're actually going to make a couple of minor changes to the scene here. And let me start by folding up the skin details. And the first thing that I'm going to do is hide the skin details, because we don't want those right now. We're going to actually build them up from scratch. And the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the lighting scenario by first just getting rid of the lights that are in the scene, because we're going to be looking at a more simplified lighting scenario, and that will allow this to render more quickly. We don't necessarily want to wait 1 minute or 2 minutes to get a refined image, although usually with preview render you can just mouse over the areas you want and continue, but you want that to be responsive. So instead of using a little bit more costly lighting scenario that looks better, we're going to go into here to environments, and you can see what I've got is I have just a basic HDR Studio, which is just one of the Modo presets. And then I've got a constant black above it, and the constant black obviously just wipes out the HDR Studio, so when I turn on the lights, that's what we see. But if we hide that constant, we're left with the HDR Studio, which I have taken this entire environment, by the way, and changed the intensity up to 6. And if you want to know more about that, I am using unclamped lighting, and I've got my input white level set to 10. Again, if you want more detail on that, go check out the previous video where we talked about lighting. So your OpenGL might look a little off. Don't worry about that. A lot of times we're not going to be really paying attention to any OpenGL when we're looking at these textures anyway. All right, so with that said, we can go ahead and hide that constant, and I'm going to unpause this one on the right. And you'll see here we're going to get, definitely a much more kind of flattened, even lighting. not as interesting, but our render time is 7 seconds as opposed to a minute. So we're using global illumination and all of the irradiance caching and everything to make this work faster. Previously that was done, the previous render was done with direct lights and global illumination mixed together, which is going to be more costly, but you definitely get a more interesting finished result. So just something to keep in mind here. All right, so as we move on here, I'm going to be using pretty much solely textures out of Modo, so procedural textures, but all of this same kind of stuff works with also with painted and bitmapped images, so you can bring in JPEG or PNG files or Targa files or whatever the case may be. Same kind of things will apply, and that will also give you the flexibility to paint in details, either here in Modo or in another application like Photoshop. But I'm just going to be using procedural textures here to look at what we've got going on. So as we start looking at this character, the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at breaking up the overall surface as far as color goes. All right, so I'm going to we're going to say goodbye to our nicely rendered guy here, and I'm going to leave this right-hand screen here. I'm going to click pause, and if you don't have a second screen here, by the way, if you just open up Modo and your default setting doesn't have two, all you need to do here is hold Control, and if you mouse over the top left corner and click and drag to the right, it will split that horizontally, which I don't want to do, so I'm just going to right click here, click delete, and you'll see it'll just go back. So if you only have a single screen up here, again, Control or Command click if you're on a Mac, click and drag to the right, and we'll split it left to right. And I find this is really useful because it allows you to have something good to reference as you move on. So with this one paused, any changes that we make are not going to affect this one. Now this one we're going to unpause, and that's going to give us now essentially the same thing, but as we go on and make our changes, we'll have a good kind of comparison point from our basic texture through to our more complex layered texture. All right, so first thing that we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at, as I said, the diffuse color. So I'm going to start here just by adding a layer, and I'm going to go to Enhance, Modo Textures, and I'm going to look in the organic section in this case, and I'm going to start just by using a dirt texture, and that's going to dump right onto the diffuse color. Okay, so as we look at this, you see that we get this nice kind of general splotchiness. And as I had said before, we want to look at isolation and bracketing. This is not very isolated at this point because we have everything going on with the material underneath. So in order to kind of allow us to actually isolate things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer here, and I'm going to put in a material which is going to have the specular and Fresnel turned off. And it's just going to be a super basic shader. And then I'm going to drop it down underneath this new layer that I've added, that dirt layer. And you can see now, we can see a very quick look at what is really going on underneath. Okay, so this is giving us our diffuse color, which right now is running just from, if we look at here, from black to white, with the variation here. So we're going to be getting mostly shades of gray. Now, there are two ways of doing bracketing, and one is going to be using just basically blend modes. So you could change the blend mode. With the blend mode at normal, here, let's go ahead and hide our diffuse here, and I'm going to give this a little bit more of a kind of skin color here. So let's just go to maybe right about there. All right, so we're just giving this a little bit more of a skin color. So if I put this on here, obviously it overrides everything. So again, the two ways that we can do bracketing are going to be using blend mode. So, say I might want to use a multiply blend node. You can see this kind of works, but it's getting it very, very dark. This would be an example of the bracketing downwards. So the very most this is going to get up to is our underlying color, because everything is going to get darker. With a multiply, that's what's happening. You're basically taking a 0 to 1 value and you're multiplying what's underneath by that 0 to 1 value. It's 0. Anything multiplied by 0 is going to be 0, so you're going to get very dark, down to black actually. And anything multiplied by 1 is going to give you, the initial value. But on a texture like this, we don't tend to see the 1 very often. So having this set to multiply, we're definitely going to see everything looking a little bit darker. If you have a general coloration that you like, which again was going to be, this one that I had here underneath, then a good blend mode to use is going to be the overlay mode. And what overlay does is it takes 50% gray and it essentially makes that the neutral color where it won't affect anything. And then anything above 50% is going to lighten what's underneath, and anything below 50% gray is going to darken what's underneath. And that also works not just with shades of gray, but with colors as well. So that's going to be using a blend mode to do bracketing. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to normal. And the other way that we can do bracketing is just by actually using colors and using the layer itself without a blend mode. So let's go ahead and take this color here, and I'm just going to drop it down there, if it'll drop. Apparently Windows doesn't want to drop that for me, but that's okay. So there we go. It actually did drop in. It just didn't want to show up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it first here, both my foreground and my background, to that basic color, right? And now all I have to do to create some variation in this is to make my background and foreground colors either lighter or darker. Now initially I had black here and white here, which means that my background color is going to be what's going to highlight my darker and darken it, or my foreground color is going to be what's going to lighten the material. Now I don't have to keep it that way. If I didn't like it that way, I could always invert that by making the background lighter and the foreground darker, but how it was initially set up is is with that. So let's go ahead and make this a little darker. And I'm holding shift, by the way, and clicking and dragging on here so that we stay in the same hue range, but we're just lightening and darkening it. And there you can see that we start to get that bracketing going on here. And the more I decrease this one and increase this one, the more variation we're going to see, but also the more we're going to lose the texture was underneath. So if I hide this, you see that we're not seeing quite as much of that pinkness because we don't have that range going on here. All right, so I'm going to actually just back up couple of steps. There we go, to about this. So I think something like this is actually pretty much okay. And now when I just have this thing isolated, just this texture isolated, and I could do that before or after I set up the bracketing, then you can adjust the general scale and just the overall placement of this texture. If you're dealing with an image-based texture that is UV mapped and specifically oriented to your model, that's obviously not going to be necessary. But if you're dealing with a tiling texture that's using cubic mapping or something like that, this is going to be necessary. So let's go ahead to our texture locator. And I think just in general, I'm finding the variation to be a bit on the large side. So I'm just going to scale this whole thing down. Right now we're looking at 30 millimeters. And I'm going to go down to something like, I'm going to try cutting that in half. So I'm just going to press /, which is divided by 2, hold Control or Command if you're on a Mac, and hit Enter, and then just going to put all of them down so that they stay equal. So they're down to 15 millimeters, and I think that is a lot better. Okay, and now the last thing that we can look at doing here with this, and let's go back to the texture layers again, is blending, and that's gonna just be another kind of level of the bracketing, is just setting up how much this is actually going to be affecting what's underneath. Now if I like this but it's just too heavy on the contrast, it's just a little too heavy-handed, now I can just take this whole thing and let's turn my opacity down to, say, I don't know, maybe 65%. And there you see we still get that variation, but now that variation is showing up over the top of the original. So if I hide my my extra material here and we go back to our initial color, you can see that there we have those colors in. The big difference here is that this was based off of a lighter color. So actually I probably should have done that. So here, let's go ahead and do this real quick. I'm going to take this one here and put that in. You can see that is significantly lighter. And let's go back to our dirt. And I'm going to use the lighter color, and again the lighter color, and you'll see once I'm not explaining this, you can see how much quicker this is to set up. So make that one a little darker, that one a little lighter, and there we go. And also I think I like this to be a little bit heavier now that it's on a real material, so I'm going to put it up to maybe about 80%. And there you go. You can see we've got a little bit of variation now in the overall color of the skin. Okay, so if I hide that, we're looking at this, which is basically going to be what we have on the right. If we show it again, you'll see that now we have this. So we get a little bit more, just just breakup of the overall color. Now this breakup is uniform. It's across the whole surface. It's not responding to any geometry. It's just, plastered out in there into the scene. We'll get into a little bit more geometrically specific stuff here in a moment. So now a lot of times when you're doing something like this with diffuse color, you'll see that my specular color is actually just a little bit lighter version of my diffuse color. So what I'm going to do here with this diffuse color and my specular color is I'm just going to create an instance of this. Now you can always do completely specific textures for the diffuse and the specular, or the diffuse and the specular and the subsurface, all those things. You can always make those specific. For the sake of what we're doing here, I'm going to make them the same, but then I'm just going to add a little variation to make it a little bit lighter. So here, let's go ahead and I'm going to create an instance of this one. So this dirt, we're going to change from diffuse color, and I'm going to change this to my specular color. And this is going to get a little bit darker on the specular side. So we have a couple of options. The first option is going to be to just lighten the background and foreground colors on the specular color. The downside to that is if I do that, it's going to make it so that any changes that I make to the diffuse color are not going to be propagated onto the specular color, which is to say, once I change these values, you can see they've got a purple dot here, it uncouples them from the main. Since this is an instance, it's tied to it. But once you change something, you've decoupled it and it doesn't follow the instance anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer in here, and I'm going to go to processing, and I'm going to add in a process, and I'm going to change this process to my specular color. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my value by, I don't know, say about 30%. And I'm going to decrease my saturation just a little bit, because as you pull the value up, you tend to get a little bit heavier saturation. So I'm going to pull my variation back maybe, or my saturation back maybe 15%. So now anything that I do with the specular color is now going to show up as being a little bit lighter, and I don't have to change anything. All I have to do is change the diffuse color, and the specular color will go along for the ride, including being a little bit lighter. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these couple of things, toss them down to the bottom, and actually I'm going to toss the process down underneath that material as well. And now I'm going to pull the material back on, and we're just going to be looking at essentially, again, that blank slate. So the next thing that we want to look at now is the specular amount and the reflection amount. And why that's going to, why we're going to leave this basic material here first is because, again, we want to separate this out. We want to isolate so that we can adjust the texture first, and then we can make it apply to the actual, texture layer that we're looking at. In this case, it's going to be this specular amount. So let's go ahead in here, and I'm going to choose a different material. So let's go to organic, and I'm going to use, down off screen there, I'm going to use veins. All right, so the veins is going to be a little bit on the kind of on the crazy side for this, but actually, no, I take it back. I'm going to use that one a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and hide that. I'm going to use that here in a little bit, but let's go ahead and change that. I don't want to use the veins. I'm going to go to organic, and I wanted to use concrete. It's just similar in a lot of ways to the dirt, but it's much smoother. But I was also going to make this much smaller, and this is just going to be breaking up the specular highlights as well as the reflections. So I'm going to start here with the texture locator, and I'm going to bump this down to something like 5 millimeters. Again, hold Control and hit Enter, and that will apply onward. And that's probably still a little on the big side. So let's go down to 2 millimeters. So something like that. Yeah, and I think that's going to work. Again, I'm not looking at the point of this tutorial is not to set up a super specific material, but rather to show you how you can apply these things, to get a better finished result. All right, and so once I've got that laid out the way I want, and I see that everything looks good, again, all I'm going to do now is we're going to hide our real basic material there, and I'm going to change this from diffuse color to my specular amount. And at first it's going to get nuts, because it's going to have some areas that give us 100% specular and some areas that give us 0% specular and reflection, so it's going to look crazy. So again, we can use in this case, I actually am going to use a blend mode, but if you don't want to use a blend mode, if you want to bracket this kind of more manually inside the actual texture layer, you'd want to go here and check with my specular amount, which is 4%. So you can see this is obviously a lot more than 4. And then my Fresnel is 100%. I'm not going to really mess with my Fresnel right now. Again, if you want to, you could always apply the same thing and go back and check on your Fresnel the same way. So let's go here to my concrete, and I'm going to change the blend mode to overlay. So I'm going to use overlay again here. And you'll see immediately this is going to get much, much more subdued. In here, while we're working on this, again, we're going to keep in that vein of isolation here. So I'm going to hide my specular and my diffuse stuff that I had done already. And you can see that, mainly what we're looking at here is going to be over the top of the head where there's that big specular highlight. And you can see that it is getting broken up now. Now in context, it looks a little on the tight side. So I'm going to take my size here and put it up to 4 millimeters on both of these. Yeah, that works a little bit better. And you can see that this is looking definitely a bit on the heavy side. And since I'm using a blend mode, all of my my adjustment here to how heavy it is going to be going on in the opacity layer. Now, if you're using a blend mode, you can also adjust your foreground and background colors or foreground and background amounts, but I find that it adds one extra kind of layer of possible failure to your texture creation. So it's not going to matter much more than adjusting your opacity, unless you really specifically see stuff on the high end that you want to knock back, then maybe you pull back your foreground value or foreground color depending on the channel you're on. But, for the most part, you can just look here at the opacity. So I'm going to pull my opacity back to, let's go to 65%, kind of a nice mid-ground that I usually like to start at. And something like that I think works pretty well. Okay, so now we've got that. Now we can, unisolate here. And we're going to put in our specular and diffuse colors. And now we're ready to kind of continue on. So the last thing that we're going to look at here in this kind of chapter of material creation is we want to look at some more now model specific things that we can use to adjust the texture. So the things that I've done here have just been pretty much just blanket stuff that you could apply, to any human face, and it's pretty much going to work. You might want to tweak the values a little bit, but for the most part, it's going to work because it doesn't rely on anything specific to the model to make it work. All right, so let's take this and pull this down here. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is stuff that is going to affect contours of the object. And if we open up here and look inside the skin details, you can see that I've got some occlusion passes here, and that's going to be essentially what we're going to be looking at now is going to be the occlusion pass. So I'm going to do the same thing here. We're going to bring our basic material back online, and I'm going to add a layer. And I'm going to go to processing and put an occlusion texture on here. And the base default occlusion is not going to work real well for this case. We'll usually want to be using either convexity, concavity, or convexity and concavity, depending on what you're actually looking at doing. Now, if you are in Modo 10, you also have a thickness channel that you can use here, which is great if you want to simulate subsurface scattering or other things that might be dependent on the thickness of the object. So just a note here, if you're in Modo 10, you should have thickness available. So I'm going to start here just looking at the concavity here. And what this is going to do is this is going to take areas of wrinkles, divots, areas around the eyes and that kind of stuff, and it's going to apply the first color, so color 1 or value 1, again, depending on what we're looking at here. If you're looking at an amount, so something like specular amount, for example, you're going to be looking at the values. If you're looking at a color, so diffuse or specular color, you're going to be looking at the colors. So just something to keep in mind. And we can see here that in the areas around the neck and here, around the eyes, and in these wrinkles, we're seeing quite a bit more darkness. Now, this kind of thing just by itself can help add quite a bit of extra character that is going to be specific to the model. So if I take this here just right off the bat, and let's take it, and I'm going to set the blend mode here to multiply. So let's just change this to multiply. It's going to be super heavy at first, so we'll then of course want to back that off. And on something like this, it tends to get very dark, so this one I usually start on the lower end, so maybe about 35%. And there you can see that we're starting to get definitely some more highlighting of the wrinkles and the crevices and the character of this character's face. No pun intended there. If you wanted to, you could also, at this point here, let's back off one layer, change this to normal, put this back to 100%. This is where you would want to adjust how the actual occlusion texture is being applied here. So this is where you might want to do things like, put in some variation, adjust the occlusion distance. If this is too tight, for example, maybe we want to put it up to 300 millimeters, and then we're going to get a little bit more spread off of the areas, which is going to just tend to soften the effect of this a little bit. It's giving us a little bit more gradation between the dark areas and the light. You can also mess around with spread and cavity angles, that kind of thing. I'm not going into that because this is not a texture-specific tutorial. We're looking more at the overall procedure. Let's go with something like that. I think works pretty well. And once again, I'm going to change this blend mode to multiply. I think 35 was a little light, so I'm going to go to 40%, just up it a little bit. Especially because I softened that out by increasing the occlusion distance. Maybe we'll go up to 45%, just give it a little bit more. And I really don't want this to affect the diffuse color so much, as what I'm going to do is apply this to the diffuse amount, which in the case of this very simplified material that we have here is going to look almost the same, but once we apply that onto our more detailed base material, we'll get a little bit different look. So let's go ahead and change this to diffuse amount. And again, looks almost the same. But now we're going to hide our base material here. So again, we're looking at this as our basic material. And you can see that we're definitely starting to get a little bit more character inside of this object. Okay, and once again, just keeping in the vein of isolation, we're going to have a look at this as just the basic material with the diffuse amount turned on. You can see we're definitely getting a little bit more definition around these characters' wrinkles, the sags under the eyes, and that kind of thing. So we want to look at it that way. And then we're going to go ahead and turn all those back on. So we're pretty much back to our, as it stands, full texture. All right, and so now the very last thing that we're going to look at here, and actually let me take that, drag that down, is we're going to look at, now we've looked at kind of geometrically object-specific stuff. Now we're going to look at specific stuff that is actually set up on this character. So now if I change this from advanced to vertex map, and I make sure I have this model selected, and we go up to weight maps, you'll see that I have an SSS weight map. And what this basically is it's a mostly two-tone version of a weight map here, that if I change this over to perspective so we can look at it a little bit more in detail, where it's got 100% through the majority of the face, the base of the nose, the bottom of the nose here, the ears, everything. I'll have 100%. And then areas where we're going to have thinner skin, or we're going to have bone closer to the surface of the skin. That's going to be like the top of the head here. Maybe the areas right around the eyes where we wouldn't see quite as much subsurface. Definitely the bridge of the nose here where we've got a bone just really close to the surface of the skin here. And the jawline and the chin, again, just areas where we have a little bit more, bone underneath the surface here. I've got the weight map set down to 0. Now you could obviously go in and add a little bit more detail. Maybe this wouldn't be all the way to 0 here in the jawline and the chin. Maybe you'd want to set this to 60 or 70%. Maybe same kind of thing here on the eyes. Well, you still want to retain kind of that 0% through the bridge of the nose and then the back of the skull here, because these are going to be areas where you just don't see as much subsurface scattering. But we do have this here, and what this is this is going to allow us to now create a weight map texture that we can use to add some variation to the actual subsurface amount. So once again, we're going to go back to our basic shader here, and we're going to go and put on process, and I want to turn on a weight map texture. And if you already had that selected, you should get this showing up, and he's going to all of a sudden look like he's from a Kiss cover band. It's all right, don't freak out. This is just because we're seeing it as a diffuse color, and that's okay. So we see the general idea here, where we've got the darker areas, or the 0 influence here and through here and around the eyes and the jaw, and then 100% influence everywhere else. All right, so all I need to do here really is I need to set this up so that it's going to properly affect the subsurface scattering. So really, in this case, it's not going to do me much good to have this over that super basic material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that one off, and I'm going to change this from diffuse color to subsurface amount. And right off the bat, everything is going to look, again, a little bit nuts, and that's okay, because now we're going to 100% subsurface, which means we're just getting the subsurface color, and all the way down to 0, which, again, not what we want. So we're going to start by changing this to multiply, because we don't want to get any more subsurface than we've gotten already here. So we can see this is kind of giving us what we want, but the problem is that it's a little heavy-handed, right? And that's because we're going all the way down to 0% subsurface there, which is not what we want. So again, we're left with two options here. We can either change the opacity, which we could do, or we can take and we can do something like increasing the value. Remember, this is an amount, so we'll be looking at the values, not the colors. Increasing this base value so that we're allowing a little bit more of the subsurface to come in. And that's what I'm going to do here. Just so that it allows more of the subsurface into this area without really affecting what's going on here. So I'm going to take my value 1 here, and I'm going to set this up to maybe 50%. And what that's going to do now is we're going to have whatever we had here as our basic amount, and then half of the basic amount here. And even that's not enough. So let's go ahead and take this up to, maybe 80%. There you go, and something like that is starting to work here. Now, again, if you want more variation than this, this would be where you might want to come in here and, maybe I'm going to take everything along here, along the base of the jaw, and I'm just doing a super, super quick selection here. I'm not going to spend the, if I miss something, that's all right, but I think this is pretty simple. So let's go ahead and just grab these, and I'm going to bring up my model panel here so that I've got it on hand. Shift W to get my weight map tool, and this was at 0, so let's change this maybe to 30% and then click. So now we're going to see that we're going to get even less variation right through there. And I think that's working pretty well. And as you go along making this kind of variation changes, you may then want to go back and revisit what your values are set at. So let's go ahead and turn my symmetry on, and I'm going to grab maybe just this stuff right around here, and just this stuff right up under the eye, where I think maybe this should have a little bit more subsurface. And again, Shift W. And I'm going to use the same 30% right there. This stuff right here under the eyes, I don't want to see quite so much subsurface, so that's okay. And maybe right here as we're getting down into the bridge of the nose, again, maybe I want a little bit more gradation there. So now you can see that I've got a little bit more variation. And as we go in here, that's starting to give me a much more interesting look at how our character's skin is reacting. And I'm going to do one more here where I'm going to go to this layer here, Shift W, and I'm going to put this one maybe at, let's see, this is right at the border there, so I'm going to put this one at 70, and actually 70 is a little high. Let's do 40. Yeah, and then I'm going to take this little bit right through here, which is kind of where we have our gradient happening, and I'm going to change this one down to maybe 20 or 15. So we're just getting a little bit more blend between where we have our full subsurface and where we don't here at the base of the skull. All right, so that pretty much does it, and you can use this same technique to build up pretty much any kind of material. So if you think of something like a metallic surface, you could start with something like chrome, and then maybe you want to decrease the amount or increase rather the amount of roughness in the same kind of areas where you want to add a little bit of bumps so you get the feeling of scratches where that chrome surface is going to be less perfect. Maybe you want to decrease the overall level of reflectivity in areas, using something like an occlusion shader where you're seeing less of the reflectiveness in those concave areas, because that would be where grime and things would build up, so you would get a less reflective surface or something like that. But this exact same technique can be used really kind of across the board to start creating more complex shaders. Just remember that we're looking at isolating the texture layers that we're using, and that applies also if you're using bitmap textures, JPEGs, PNGs, whatever the case may be, or if you're painting. You isolate those so you can see how the texture is laying on the surface, and then we also look at bracketing and how we're using our base shader in order to give us a good starting and jumping off point, and then we're just going around the general area of where we were when we created that. In some cases, that bracketing is going to kind of evenly surround the base color, kind of like we did with the diffuse color. In some areas, that is going to kind of work from that initial color downward or upward. In the case of like we did with the subsurface amount, where we started using a multiply blend mode at our base amount, which was 50%, and we worked downward from there so that we didn't get any brighter, or you could do it the other way where you're not getting any darker than your basic setup. So I hope that helps. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video or videos like it, you can subscribe and get all of them on Patreon. You can get downloadable versions of the videos as well as all of the content and scene files associated with them. You can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Ellery, or if you like to get this episode or any other episode of Moto with Ellery in an a la carte fashion or in packs, you can get different groups of them so that you don't have to put all of the individual ones in your cart. You can get those on Gumroad, and that is gumroad.com/Ellery. That does it for this one. Go make something cool, and I'll see you in the next one.